had discuss career pathways for female filmmakers and specifically focusing on inclusivity of more female talent. But this panel is really a larger focus, widening out on the same topic. And so we'll have all these wonderful filmmakers introduce themselves, but who you see in front of you represent different cultures, different backgrounds, different voices, and people who've been able to create their art, create their work, and hopefully find a space in the industry that had been and continues to be white male dominated. So welcome everybody to the Growth of Inclusion panel, and panelists, please give us your introductions.
Thank you. My name is Natasha Kermani. I am a writer and a director primarily in genre, so science fiction, horror, fun stuff like that. My first feature film was actually half in Farsi language, which was something we just sort of did to do. It felt right. And it ended up being a really interesting experience. And so yeah, so that journey has just sort of continued of trying to create work in the genre space that is reflective of my reality. And so yeah, excited to talk more about this with you guys.
Hi, I'm Marissa Johnson, and I'm a writer, producer, and filmmaker. I started out as a writer, writing poetry and memoir, and veered into the film industry, doing some screenwriting and producing. I work in virtual production right now, and very much focused on my own life as a queer person and a queer person from a queer family.
Hi, I'm Mad Hamdan. I'm a multi-platform filmmaker, so I just write stories for a bunch of different platforms. I'm Palestinian, and a lot of my work revolves around stories of being Palestinian, being displaced, feminist themes, and a lot of migration themes. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Thank you.
Hey, I'm Kat Meister. My pronouns are they, them, or he, him. I'm a trans non-binary filmmaker and theater professional. I've worked in theater for the last 8+ years and have pivoted during the pandemic. Discovered a love of film and wrote, directed, and produced my own short film in that time, which I then released to the public for Pride Month of this year. So yeah, I'm just really excited to be here. Thanks.
My name is Jorge Suarez. I'm a director, producer, writer, editor, a little of everything, independent filmmaker, you know. I'm originally from Mexico City. I fell in love with filmmaking in Seattle, though I did most of my growing up in the Pacific Northwest, and then moved down to Los Angeles about almost 20 years ago. I've just been a filmmaker ever since. Recently worked with Rosa on a current project. We just took our pilot to AFM, trying to get it sold as a series and picked up for the next step. But she was like, "You want to come and talk movies and stuff in Ojai?" I was like, "Yeah, that would be great." So that's what we're doing.
So
thanks for being here, everybody.
Yeah. So we're talking about how this focus, this really stated and now hopefully institutionalized focus on being more inclusive in Hollywood has maybe affected you, maybe it hasn't, but if it has, and if it's affected you in your chosen role, can you please speak about that? And it could be anything from how you've chosen to write, or how you've chosen to cast, or produce and crew up, but, please.
Well, I grew up on Star Trek, so for me,
a wonderful diverse
yeah, and I think I bring that up because there is, I think, there is cinema used as a lens for universality, right? Like using that way to share experience, and Star Trek being something that all of my family from Iran and my American family, we could all sort of bond over, and that, I think, commonality of experience through, be it Star Trek or some movie that everybody loves, I think for me was always very inspiring. So I think it's actually been there from the beginning, and I think it's also been there from the beginning with genre specifically. So speaking to science fiction, to horror, as being something that like you don't necessarily need to speak the language, right? You don't necessarily need to have all those cultural stepstones. So I think genre is a really exciting place always, but now even more so. So I think in horror, I think people are really looking to international folktales, international like monsters from all over. And so I think I see that appetite really growing. And I know there's been a lot more sort of like interests from executives and people in those scary rooms of wanting to hear, oh, what is that folktale from Iran? What is that Japanese folktale that you want to adapt? So I think there is a little bit more of an excitement about those international stories.
Very cool.
I have so many thoughts about LGBTQ people in film and TV. And most of them center around an illusion of progress rather than real progress. I think now we are seeing more and more queer people, or queer characters, but many of the storylines play back to the same old tropes, or trap queer people in tragedy, and mostly in the past. Mostly, like any lesbian story that's out there is mostly like a historical period drama that ends in tragedy, or ends with someone being crazy, or ends with queer people going back to a straight relationship. So I don't know, I was trying to think through these questions, and I think it's a really exciting time to see more queer characters. I think we need to see more queer people at the top level of all decision making in film and television, and never forget that it is like always a fraught political time for queer people even now, and that there is such wonderful power in seeing yourself in so many different ways on screen or through complex stories, especially during a time where LGBT rights are under fire yet again. It's very mixed for me right now, and I'm trying to work through that. And I think most of my work is very much drawn towards like portrait of a life type of work, and I think a lot of times those stories of queer people are siloed into being directed towards queer people, not just general like everyone. Queer stories aren't given a lot of marketing or distribution in the same way that regular straight stories are. So yeah, it's just a huge focus of my work, and something that I'm just very passionate about and seeing my career in. And we'll see how things progress. I mean, I think it will keep getting better. I just want more radical stories out there.
Okay, this one's a complicated one for me as well. I'm gonna echo a lot of what Marissa said, where yes, we are seeing more diverse people or more Arab or Muslim people on screen, but it's complicated in that they're still boxed into these really rigid stereotypes, and these stereotypes I think don't just come from the people that are putting them on screen, they also come from us. Which is like we are also boxing ourselves into specific stereotypes because it makes us more marketable. It's easier to enter the industry with something that is familiar to other people. So like you'll see, the Muslim girl who's struggling with the veil, who like is like, oh, but I have an American boyfriend and I want to take off the veil. But I can't, and then there's like all these, topics of like oppression or I don't know, or like abuse. There's a lot of abuse there, but seldom do you see someone that's like, oh, I'm actually very comfortable in my veil, and I'd like to just keep it and not address it, because I mean, in our culture we don't address it. It's very normal, and so it's like, in a way, it is a step forward in that it's amazing. I get to see more people who look like me on screen, but it's also a step. It's also 2 steps backwards, because it's like I'm also seeing things that me and my community and my culture have definitely moved past already, but we're just revisiting them again. To very quickly touch on it, I mean, this is something that my work also like explores, kind of like how to tell these stories without boxing myself back into a stereotype of oppression or war or like closed-minded, closed-minded religion, or trying to not be too political with my work, but also it's again a bit complicated, because even when you're not trying to be political, that becomes a statement, which then becomes political. But yeah.
I will say that I feel a lot of the things that have been said, and especially with the specific attacks on the trans community legislatively happening right now and have been gearing up for years, etc. With the expanded visibility, it's a double-edged sword. I read an article recently that was talking about how the hot new commodity in like film and TV is a trans best friend character. Hey, so it's like, yes, I'm glad to see more trans characters on TV. I also love to see them played by trans actors. That's great. I love that. But when you're relegated to, oh, you're put into this box of now you're the trans best friend, you are asexualized, you are put off into the side, you are not deemed a real person because you're just the best friend character. And like there's kind of a lack of humanity in that. And I know that other people and other ethnicities and types of people have been put into this box before. It's a box we're very familiar with, and it's not right. And it's like the representation, being able to see these people, see trans people play trans actors is great, but we need to expand past those stories, and we need to see trans people as humans. We need to, like, that's, and you know, that's something that just I have a lot of feelings about. I think I had more to say, but I got lost in sauce. So.
We're here for a while. Well, chances. You know, for me, it was kind of a process, like leaning into the diversity thing. I think it kind of played into more of my insecurities at first, early on. Because I was born in Mexico City, and I come from a very traditional Mexican family, almost to a fault sometimes, but it gives me tons of material. but the truth is I had to actually lean into that because I was a little insecure about it at first. I was like, am I supposed to be telling stories about my ethnicity and my background? Is this really what is important? And I fell in love with filmmaking before I really even realized that my diversity was a strength, because it made me realize that it gave me a very particular insight and perspective on humanity and culture and all these things. And if you keep following that path down the road, you realize that's why it's important for us to do things like this, so that we can talk to other people who are going to hear it, hopefully younger people, and go like, oh, I don't have to be insecure about the fact that I'm not like everybody else, and it actually is a strength, and I'm here to say something really important. So that took a while. That was part of a process. I was already clearly into filmmaking before I even realized that was something that I should, kind of prop up and kind of explore and really try and strengthen in myself and in the work that I create.
You spend so much time trying to not be the other.
Right. No, and I'm telling you, I mean, and it's ugly, right? Like, but this is why we talk, right? Like to tell people, like, hey, you got to kind of be yourself, and you got to be comfortable. And not only is that going to be better for you, but you as a result are going to be a better human being for other people.
There's institutionalized traditional power structure. And when you're not part of what we call male, pale, and Yale was the power structure, when you're not part of that and you're other, a little bit other, you're keenly aware of that. Like my father is from Italy, and I remember being at a Women in Film event. It must have been about 17 years ago, and there were a group of mainly Black and Latina women I was sitting with talking about the gangsterism and being portrayed as gangsters, and I went, I'm Italian. Like, it's really horrible, but yeah, I get a lot of the mafioso stereotype comes at me just because I'm Italian. And this idea of institutionalized power structure benefits from putting certain types of people from certain types of backgrounds into stereotypical roles. But it doesn't benefit me when I have friends seriously like, well, can't like the mafia help you fund your films? No, just because I'm Italian doesn't mean I'm gonna like have mafia connections and mafia money? Are you kidding me? But I have been asked that before, which is stupid. But the fact is that when you deal with, and you know, these are very heavy stereotypes. In fact, I can say that everybody sitting here could just list off what stereotypes occur for their communities. So these heavy stereotypes are in place because some traditional power structure, like I mentioned, you know, male paling Yale, must have a benefit off of it. And the roots are very deep. So one of the things I want to ask is, are there characters in film and TV that have an impact on you because they do come from the community you're from, and in what way have you seen yourself and your community reflected back to you on stage? And I'm not talking about necessarily positive, like I just said about, you know, mafiosi Italians, so.
Who wants to
Yeah,
say?
take a moment,
we don't get
think about it, anybody?
I can jump in. I will say one of the first real representations that I saw of my community was on a TV show called Work in Progress. The first season, the end of that first season was not great in terms of my community, but there was an episode where the main character and her boyfriend went to like a queer brunch, and I like saw the cast and the background that they had cast for this queer brunch and the actors that were there, and I was like, I've been to that brunch. I know each of those people, not personally, but like it was very accurate in terms of who my community is, and I was like, oh, I feel so seen, which was really, really cool. Another character that is recent was on Our Flag Means Death. They have a non-binary character played by Vico Ortiz. And the writing for them is just so on point. Like, it's a silly, fun pirate, maybe pirate kind of show. That's a comedy, but like, there are non-binary writers in that room, and you can tell. You can absolutely tell, and it makes the whole show just come alive with this kind of authenticity that the ridiculousness of the situation that they're in doesn't matter. And so I love to see that.
I can jump in. There's two, more so shows than films. There's two shows that have recently come out. One called Rami, which is about an Egyptian American man, and the other called Mo, which is about a Palestinian American man. And I will say, like, those were both, it was so good, first of all, so good to see people like who I could relate to on screen, but at the same time they still fell victim to the same thing, which is like going back to kind of stereotyping yourself in a way, but it's still in comparison to, let's say, 5-10 years ago, which this was non-existent. So like, I will always support that. I will always be like, yeah, push it forward, do that more. But when it comes to films, maybe not so much, because when it comes to films, it's still all about war. It's still all about like radicalized religion. It's still, and even when those films are absolutely beautiful, like they're beautifully shot, the actors are amazing, the writing is amazing, the writing is authentic, we still end up with just moments that feel familiar, and then a big portion of it that just feels like it feels like a stereotype. It feels like, yes, I understand, war is a part of our culture, it's in the background, but it cannot be in the foreground all the time. Otherwise, that will always be what we are, or what we're reduced to.
I had a similar thing with, like, it didn't really jump out at me right at first. Like, when I was younger, I remember would always see characters that were of like Hispanic descent, and they were always like the gardener or like the housekeeper, right? And it's so interesting because I remember, I recalled like the moment I realized this might be a problem. It wasn't even like my thing. It didn't bother me because I was kind of young and, you know, so kind of like attuned to American culture at that point. But I noticed my parents, it kind of bummed them out. I noticed it hurt them more. Like, and my dad would mention it, like, of course, like the gardener is the Mexican character, you know. But I don't know. I guess for me it's like one of those things where it's like, okay, well, if that's taking up such a shallow lane, there must be a ton more that's just not explored. And I feel like that's kind of where we get to jump in and say, you know, this is where we can kind of make it a little bit deeper and kind of, you know, get to know these characters in a more human way. I also kind of still wrestle with whether or not it's a good idea to use those stereotypes as kind of like a delivery method for newer messaging. Like, I'm getting ready to do another portion of the show that's called La Maria. And La Maria, if you say that like in Mexico, that's like a slang term for the maid. So it's like if you drive down the streets in the expensive neighborhoods in Mexico and you know, Las Marias are on lunch break, you can kind of see they're all out and everything. And so, but that term, I get that it's, you know, we want to be more than that, but I debate whether or not that's a smart idea to kind of use that as a jumping off point and then take it somewhere where people don't normally get to see it, which has been kind of the idea. But I don't know. It's like, do I do it? Is it a bad idea? Should I just not make her a maid? But then I'm also like, you know, let's not pretend like we're not still kind of reflecting these things, because that's still very much common in our society. We see it a lot. So there's a lot to balance there.
It's a huge struggle. It's a huge struggle also when you're trying to sell your work.
Yeah.
So like you're trying to, like you want to step away from these stereotypes. You don't want to make, at least for us, you don't want to make more films about war. But then you finish your film and you try to get it into a film festival, and it's like, it's almost like they're telling you this doesn't feel Arab enough. Why? Because there's no bombs in the background? Like, what's...
Why aren't they in hijab? Why aren't they?
Yeah, or exactly, or something like that. And it's like it's the institution. It's institutionalized in that, like, the system is like this, but it's also it forces you to, even when you want to create new work, you have to do it in a way that's like, I can start it off this way and then change it to something else, you know. But then that place also gets very comfortable.
Yes.
No, it's just interesting. I think authenticity is something I think about quite a bit. A lot. And I think, you know, a lot of the diaspora, you know, children of immigrants, immigrant community in America, we struggle with this quite a bit, right? Because ethnically, yes, I am ethnically Persian, but I grew up in America. My life is New York City, right? Like, I grew up in New York. And so how do you reconcile those things? And in terms of your question of when you saw yourself reflected, I promise all of my answers won't have to do with Star Trek, but
I think they should.
How can I always bring it back to Star Trek? No, Mr. Spock, the character of Mr. Spock is half Vulcan, he's half alien, and he's half human. And I really, even before I was old enough to understand why I was so drawn to this character, as an adult, I realized that's why I was drawn to this person who culturally, physically, he has physical differences, right? Like, why do I wish my eyebrows were thinner? You know, it's all those things. Used to, I don't anymore. Now I really fully embrace them. But that character, seeing somebody sort of grappling with the being the fulcrum of 2 points, right? Like being the center where two worlds meet, was really, I think, impactful for me. And I will just also say more recently, many people probably know there's a huge political movement happening in Iran right now.
Yes.
And what we're seeing is video content. And so this isn't seeing yourself in film, but watching those videos the last 7 weeks and seeing your own face reflected in the faces of those women and those people fighting on the streets has been a true mirror in a way that I think we don't see it until we see it, and then you see yourself there. And the last thing I'll say is, that is where the authenticity is, right? So when you see those videos and you immediately think, that's my sister, that's me, that's the authenticity. So no matter where you grew up, no matter what your cultural home life was, that moment, that mirror moment is the authenticity. And I think if we give ourselves the space to accept that our authenticity is what it is for ourselves, and the emotional twist that you feel when you see your face reflected back like that, then you are doing the storytelling, right? Like you're doing the honest work in that way.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, and especially for all of these brave women in Iran standing up against the institution, the power structure, the traditional power structure, which is a big theme of what we're talking about.
And young women are huge leaders in this right now,
Young
particularly
people.
school age. I mean, it's incredible.
Teenagers.
It's incredible to see.
Well,
Yes, I can speak back, but a little off that topic. But in touch with what you were saying before, I think what I kind of struggle with in queer storytelling is that I think generally a lot of queer people are frustrated that there is so much pain in queer stories. And I am frustrated that there is so much pain in queer stories, and yet my story as a queer person is very painful. So it's like, how do you be authentic to the realities of your identity without making that the totality of your story? And I think there's really wonderful ways that you can do that, but it is something that I've been struggling with, is like, how do I write a story that's not just another queer tragedy, that acknowledges the pain, but also acknowledges the beauty and the joy and the revolutionary feeling of being queer. So that's something that I'm kind of still working through. And I didn't realize how important some of the stories that I saw when I was young were to me. But I have gay mothers, and I'm also gay. And so I have a very intergenerational experience with queerness, and feel oftentimes quite alienated in that, because I barely ever met anyone who had gay parents. I still barely know anyone who does, who is also gay themselves. I remember when I was in high school, a film came out that was called The Kids Are All Right. Yeah, and everyone was like, oh my gosh, Marissa, you have to watch this movie, it's so great, like, just watch it and you'll know. And I watched it, and I had like a visceral, horrible reaction to that movie. And if you don't know the film, it's actually, this is crazy, it's written and directed by a lesbian. And it's about these two lesbian mothers raising kids, and the kids embark on this secret mission to find their donor dad. And they find the donor dad, and then one of the moms has a sexual affair with the donor dad. And then like they kind of come back as a family, the two original moms, whatever. But I remember being like so horrified that everyone was so sure that this was the reflection of my family. And I was like, is this what you think of me? Is this what you think of my family? It is so centered around straightness, and around like, ultimately there is the natural need to have the biological mother and father reunite. It was really damaging to me. And I will say I barely ever see queer family existing. I mean, there are some, but it's so very limited. And for queer people, the most common story is just the coming out story.
Right.
And that's really it. And the trick of the coming out story is that it assumes that it almost places the burden on the queer person that their pain is because they are trapping themselves. And once they come out and they release themselves, then all of their pain has dissipated.
Which is
And they're just like,
that's just a
great.
starting.
Right? and that's like the beginning of their story, which is just not.
I think one thing that I'm hearing is there's an extreme amount of cultural gaslighting that you have to learn about, acknowledge, and then to a certain extent, my hope is that all of us as artists are finding how we can build steps to step over that, because again, there's a traditional, institutionalized power structure that may say, oh no, we've seen queer people, they're over there, that rainbow corner, see there's queer people over there. You're represented, that you're like 9% is over there. Mexicans, there's some Mexican character who's not a gardener, I swear to you there is. Like, so what have you got to complain about? But that gaslighting is also part of the institution. So it's really difficult to say, okay, yes, there's a reflection of people from my community, but it's actually unhealthy. Because just, having any kind of reflection is something more than nothing. But like I was saying about being Italian, I don't want to keep seeing gangsters or maids. Yeah. So how this background, how these forces, in a sense, cultural forces that we've all just discussed, how do they shape how you see your careers? How is this understanding shaping your career as a filmmaker, whether in writing stories, casting, or whatever role you're in as a filmmaker?
Who's going to start?
Well, you actually started because you said you were contemplating your episode La Maria.
Yeah, I'll talk about that. I think this is actually one of the things I'm most excited about, because I have now gotten a chance to see, and I'm very lucky because I get so much, we're so close to Mexico and we get a lot of exposure to Mexican cinema, and there's a lot that I've been able to kind of see from others. But what I want to get a chance to do is actually in kind of analyzing the problem and I consider myself a decent problem solver. And so I'm like, how do we really nip this in the bud? Like, how do we actually get ahead of this? How do we make it stop being the conversation and just have it be normal and accepted? And I think that is kind of what I've come to is, I think it's really important to have diversity in our work and our film and stuff, but I want to start getting to the point where it's not about the diversity. It's just diverse. Yeah. These people are here, they're part of our culture, they're part of our society, and they all want the same thing. We want peace and happiness and love for everybody, but it doesn't have to be about them being Mexican, it doesn't have to be about them being gay, it doesn't have to be about them being from the Middle East. It doesn't have, we actually just did this pilot and we got a chance to show it. And there was a couple, we've shown it a few times, and I got a chance to field some questions that I thought were really, really interesting. But I always I noticed I was getting a similar one regularly, which was like, your main character, her name is James, she's a mechanic, she's a female mechanic at that, which is, a minority group. But she, a lot of people say she seems to be undergoing some identity issues. Her father named her James. Really wanted a boy and then taught her how to be a mechanic, and now she's a super gifted mechanic, right? And she's passionate about it, she loves it. But they're like, she seems to have identity issues. Is she having gender identity crisis? And I said, well, what do you think? And they said, well, I think she kind of does, and this and that, but you don't really talk about it, you don't really go forward with it with the story anymore. And I said, okay, well, my answer was always like, because it doesn't matter. That might be where she is in her life. That might be part of the struggle that she has. And we are more dimensional than just a simple 3-act structure of a story. So maybe she is having those identity issues, but the one I'm tackling has nothing to do with that. That's just part of her flavor. That's who she is. And then she's going to go and deal with her estranged father issues, which is really what this particular story is about. But I love that, even though it was interesting to have that magnet of people going like, well, I thought it was going to be about this because it was so different. But it doesn't have to be about that. She could just be that. That's my goal, to try and perpetuate that in cinema moving forward.
And on that note, I think a lot of us are filmmakers and people who are lucky enough to be in a position to cast roles or to look at roles. And I think riding that line of opening up every single role as possible, and obviously that whole cast the best person, blah, blah, blah. But maybe people disagree with me. Not doing the colorblind casting. Colorblind is not a thing. It's not real. So I think riding that line of being truthful, again, authenticity, to the character, and okay, if we are casting we're casting an Iranian person in this role. How does that now affect the role? Do we need to do a little bit of a rewrite? Do we need to sort of like add those little touches? So, moving past, like, I love that we're in a space where you can now be in a room and you can say, hey, why don't we open up this role to these other things? But now I think it's up to us as relatively young filmmakers to take that one step further and say, okay, but let's actually be conscious that people are coming from different cultural backgrounds and this would affect the character in this way and that way. Let's keep it authentic, but while also just being like, why can't the mechanic be blah blah?
Why can't she be going through issues on her own?
Right, but then let's take it one step further and be aware and intentional with the choices that we're making.
I'm going to jump in and talk about, I'm going to answer the same question but from a completely different side, which is that I love being the token Arab person on like writers' rooms or sets or like helping Arab people tell their stories. I will say that sometimes I don't want to write Arab stories. Sometimes I want to tell other stories, and I think that I can do that. I don't need to only tell stories that are about Arabs. I can help other people tell stories about migration or displacement or talk about feminist themes, because those are also true to me. But it does not necessarily always need to be about my own culture. I actually, in recent years, I've been trying to move a little bit further away from my own culture, only because I feel like people keep wanting me to comment on my culture. It's like, what's your experience like? What's your experience like? What's it like for you as a person of color? What's it like for you as a non-American in America? Tell us about your experience. Write something about that, because that's what's authentic. It doesn't necessarily. That's not necessarily what authenticity is.
You're right. As an artist, what's authentic is what you're passionate about.
Exactly. Or the topics that you care about, the things that you research, and that doesn't always necessarily have to do with your own diversity. But then I feel like probably most of us here also struggle with that, because like we are capable. We are filmmakers who are capable and who have like started careers. And so there's a sense of responsibility for like coming in and like telling true, authentic stories about your own culture, because you can do that. And so like it becomes kind of like a little struggle within you to like, but I want to do other things, I want to talk about other things, but also I feel a sense of responsibility to set the record straight.
And it can be a struggle of resource too, thinking where's the support going to come from?
Definitely, absolutely. And on both ends, trying to tell either one of those stories, there's like, where's the support going to come from? Do I lean into who I am on paper, or do I attempt to break free of that?
I've thought about this topic a lot as well. Just being like, I'm often the token trans person in the room. And the interesting thing is, there's a trans DP who, her name is Bianca Klein. She was the DP for Marcel the Shell, the tongue twister, Marcel the Shell with shoes on. But one of her main things that she like focuses on is, yes, I made this film. Look at my work. This is my work. Yes, I'm trans, and I want to be able to say that, yeah, a trans person did that, but that should not be the sum of her identity, is that she's a trans DP. Like, that should not be the sum of her part. That should not be the sum of any of us. Like, that you are that one person in the room, oh, get to check a box kind of a thing. And that, you know, something that I experience as a transmasculine person in a room is, as I've transitioned more, I've experienced different reactions to my presence. As I've gone from looking more traditionally like passing as a cis woman versus looking ambiguous enough to pass as a cis man. Whatever those mean, I'm non-binary, so I don't subscribe to that at all. But what's fun for me is seeing what people look at and then immediately assign a gender. And it's different every time. Like, some people say man, some people say woman, some people say sir, some people go ma'am. My favorite is sir, ma'am, sir, ma'am.
And you're
That's,
like,
yeah, that's when I'm like, yes. when they do that, I just go, yes. But, you know, because I feel like we have such focus in the trans community, and the trans stories that are told are largely about the trans feminine experience, which is not my experience. And trans feminine people have so much more piled onto them because of misogyny and the patriarchy, big topics to tackle, but...
I like to say male insecurity, my friend. There's a lot of male insecurity out there that causes these problems, yes.
Absolutely, and I have to find ways to like get around that in terms of my own career and when I'm interacting with people on set. And so like a tactic that I have found is I go by my last name on set, because then people stop gendering me. Or they're just like, also it's easier to hear on walkie because like Cat sounds like Pat, sounds like Sat, sounds like Matt, sounds like a million other things, whereas Meister is very clear.
Meister, that's great.
So, you know, that's the one. And so it gives them just a little bit more of a pause, and just like having to navigate being generally the only trans person on set. Or if there's another one, like I know other trans people who have come out and lost all of their contacts. Specifically trans feminine people. They transition and they lose everything, and then they can't keep working. And it's horrible. And I like, as an up and coming filmmaker, you know, I want to change that, and I want to have the power to change that. And I am hopeful for the future, but I know that it's hard right now, and I know that that's not a struggle that is specific to the trans community. It is a struggle across communities.
And that's what she was talking about.
Yeah.
That's like, that becomes our responsibility.
Yes.
Like I mean, it sucks that we have to carry that extra weight, but I mean, you can't think about it like I'm carrying extra weight. It's like you're carrying it for the people who are going to be carrying it after you.
That's how
And
I
and if we do a good enough job, they'll be at that much better of a place by the time they get started. And then who knows, maybe we're having this panel because it's 55% to 45% and not like, you know, 8% to, you know, it's just, that's really the goal.
Yeah.
It's going to take a lot of time, but I'd like to think, just in all the things I've read and kind of a lot of the ancient philosophers, a lot of them kind of say a similar thing that only recently made sense to me, which is that like time is irrelevant. That it happens at all is really the important thing, not when. But that means we have to keep carrying this damn weight around.
Yeah. It's exhausting. And I really will say, like, it is like emotionally and mentally truly exhausting to be telling stories that are like, this is my culture. It's so personal to me, and it's so entangled in my own generational trauma that it is exhausting to be telling those stories, whether they're about myself or about a fictional character that I've written who is in this culture. So sometimes I welcome the break.
And then the alienation that it takes to try to sell those stories and try to convince other people that they are important when they're reflections of your life. And it's like, I'm important. The story's important.
Can I ask you a question about that, actually? Like, because sometimes I get a little weird when I read the subgenre of LGBTQ film. Like, why does it have to just be for them? Like, why is this not like a generalized human story? I mean, so my question is more like, how does that make you feel? About, like, do you feel weird? Like you have to make for that stuff? It's weird. Like I would feel really odd if someone were like, "Oh, you only make Mexican films." Like that's really weird.
100%. Mayara and I are very good friends. We were talking about this earlier about how even it's like I catch my own self doing some of that too, because I made a short film recently that Mayara edited. And it's like, when I go to submit it, I choose the best queer category instead of best short.
Yeah.
Or best whatever. Because you just think, oh, I'll have better chances. Or this is going to be marketable to these people.
It's a double-edged
Versus
sword.
it's just a good story or it's
Yeah.
just good art.
Sometimes I feel like
yeah.
they created that because they needed it in order to be able to sell it.
100%.
But they don't.
It's
But
marketing.
we're not.
Yeah,
we're not
you
really
see
taking into
that.
account the emotional impact.
And I would say there's not like a lack of queer storytellers or queer artists or queer talent. It is all there, but it is not bet on. It's not, people don't bet on those stories. There are very, very few like blockbuster releases of queer stories. And the ones that are very much told for a straight audience. They're not for queer people.
And for white cis men.
And for white
Ryan
cis
Murphy.
men. Exactly. Very much. So it's,
Yeah.
I think it's getting back to the discussion of like, do you like use your marginalized identity to try to like sell yourself in this market, or do you just believe that this story, whether it's about your identity or not, is as worthy as every other story? And it's just like, I don't think there's any right way when you're in a system that marginalizes you. It's like there's no right way, but I will say that like systemic inequity isn't solved by representation alone, and it's solved by systemic change. Yeah.
So it's not just what you see in front of the screen, what you see behind it.
Behind it is
is
so important.
even more important than what you're seeing in front of it, I would argue.
I will just speak a little bit because I think we're getting into an interesting space now that is very industry focused. And I'll just say that, you know, like my experience and sort of why I ended up being so drawn to genre filmmaking and horror is I felt a lot of these barriers were actually not there. Because at the end of the day, this, you know, she's the final girl. She's got to get from here to there. It doesn't matter where she's from. Doesn't matter what her language. You know, it does. I'm not saying there's no problems in the horror community. There are a myriad of problems, but there was some sort of immediacy to the story that I was able to access. And to be very blunt, the financiers and the people making these movies, they don't give a shit where this character is from, as long as they are scared and screaming at the top of their lungs and trying to get from point A to point B. Cool, fine, whatever, I know I'll sell tickets. So just from a very sort of like kind of gross marketplace perspective, I do think the genre space is a very interesting space to be exploring. And of course we see really talented people. We see Jordan Peele exploring this space. We see really exciting Iranian cinema coming out of that space. So I just think there's something interesting there that in a lot of times drama ends up being left in the dust a little bit. And it is sort of the outskirts of the industry who are sort of moving in that space because it's not prioritizing the subcategory. It's not, you don't need to market LBGT, you don't need to market whatever, foreign cinema, whatever the hell that means, I hate that so much. It's just scary, or it's a thriller, or it's whatever. So I found that very interesting for me, and it was something I didn't really discover until I was realizing, oh, this is really handy that I like making these movies, because I can put whoever I want.
We're talking about this is the next question, but we're already talking about it, which is what lasting social changes do you hope that we can make? And speak about it very personally. What impact do you want to have? What do you want to see created? Because we are the first generation doing this. So this changes now. And when we talk about any kind of diversity, inclusivity, social equity initiatives in Hollywood, 5, maybe 10 years, no, really new. So we're the front line, and what lasting social change do you hope we can make? And, you know, in my case, just very cleanly, I could say I was one of the first maybe 20 women in IATSE Local 695 as a technician in 2007. And a decade later, when I withdrew from the local, there was a 25% increase in female membership. So those are hand in hand with STEM initiatives focused towards girls in school. So if you can see it, you can be it. For me, the more visibility I can gain, I want to continue to promote STEM education for women. And as I like to say, social impact, women having careers, lucrative careers is that the machines don't care what gender you are. You can always do technical work, including editing, and those machines are not going to discriminate against you. So that is, for me, one of my goals is I want to help push that idea that women can have wonderful technical careers.
I can say that one of my goals, and that's mostly because like I write and direct, but I also produce. And I try to keep my writing and directing to my own like personal story, and producing mostly to help other people tell their stories. So I would say one of my personal goals within my career, and this was kind of like a conversation that I had with myself about 3 or 4 years ago, where I was like, okay, this is what we're doing, which is a really big push to helping people tell their own stories. Like you are from this community, you want to tell this story, you don't have the resources, you don't have the means, you don't know how to do it, and so I'm going to help you do it. I'm going to help you tell your own story, and I'm not going to come in and tell it for you. And what I am an expert in within my own life and my own culture, I will tell that story. And I'm a really big believer that if you are from a specific culture or from a specific community, tell that story. Which is a bit contradicting to what I said earlier, but like it's if you exist in the horror genre, for example, like she had mentioned, it doesn't matter as much. But if you're like if you're a Palestinian and you're trying to tell a story about what it's like to live in occupied Palestine, I think you should be Palestinian in order to tell the story.
But you get to tell it in a way that maybe hasn't been told before, or needs to be.
Exactly, and me, like having never lived in occupied Palestine, can come in and help you tell that story, but it is your story. But other people coming in to try and tell that story for you, I think it's gonna create some form of an erasure of your own story, which is incredibly problematic.
I'm really interested in what diversity of storytelling. So cinema has the ability to sort of change the way people look at the world around them, right, and the people around them. So a lot of what we're talking about here is that there's this idea, this very sort of like myopic idea that any otherized population has a monolithic experience, right? Like the MENA experience is monolithic. The gay experience, the queer experience is monolithic. Which of course is not true at all. And so I think there is this like myopic thing specifically in American cinema to always be dividing it into like what we call mainstream, otherized, whatever it is. And I actually think it leaks into our lives, right? So like when people look at their news source, right? You open up your news app and it's like US politics, blah, blah, blah. There's like 14 tabs for what's happening in America. And then there's a tab that's, says like international news. We live in a global world. There is no difference between this news. What's happening across the world affects us sitting here right now. So, if we can get rid of that myopic perspective of things by introducing these ideas and these characters and deflating the idea that there are categories, that there are sort of these pillars that we're all supposed to fit into. I'm really curious about that, and I don't know if it's going to be a successful experiment, but I think it's a very exciting experiment, and I'm looking forward to seeing if real change can be enacted that way.
Well, again, we're in the best time that there's ever been for this, with technology that allows that. For the first time, technology has become small enough and accessible enough.
Fast enough.
Fast enough
Very, very
that we are able to perhaps achieve that. So
This is kind of how, like, you asked about the what you want to see kind of stay and persist. For me, it's the demand. Like the right now, it's you gotta look at the silver lining. Like the controlling interests are listening. And they're not listening because it's like, suddenly they woke up today and they're better people. They're listening because they demand it. We're demanding it. We on some level are realizing that every dollar we spend is a vote in any particular direction. It sounds political, but you realize that actually the money, our currency, is what makes society spin. So every time you pay for something or give to this or that, you're literally voting, and it's somebody's job, no matter what it is, to collect that data. And so we're demanding that people like us get a chance to speak, because maybe the audience themselves are kind of bored at hearing the same story over and over again, and maybe they want to get other perspective that is rarely seen. Like that's what we specialize in, and that's what we have the courage, first of all, to bring that, and then the know-how on top of that. So I want to see the demand stay. I'm glad that we're having the conversation. I need to see it in practice now. I'm tired of just hearing people talking about it. That has been something that I feel like I've experienced growing up, is there always seems to be an issue, and then it's like a hot button item that people talk about for a little while, and then when our attention spans run out, we quit, or we stop, or maybe the news cycle changes or some shit. Yeah. And that's the sort of thing that I'm like, okay, we cannot let this drop. So when we talk about what are the figures, what are the numbers, so what percentage of our representation is, this background or that background, or it doesn't matter what it is, we need to see those numbers steadily increasing. And I have a feeling that, right now we're still at the phase where they kind of just, they're giving up an amount, the controlling factors are giving an amount that they're comfortable giving to kind of like quell the public. But when we break that threshold, exactly, it's a quota. That's what it is. I mean, we have it with initiatives and stuff, but once we break that, I think it's going to get real. There's going to be, there's already some people who are distraught, but we just got to kind of, lead with love, and hopefully hopefully we can kind of, stop violent outbreaks and things like that. But I think it is, as representation gets more proper, which is what we're going for, it's not always going to be pretty. So I want the demand to stay even through that.
What I'm hearing you say in some ways is not just box office returns or viewership numbers in a sense, but that the established business mechanism around entertainment is like any other business, looking at where there's growth. So if they decide Latin America is where there's growth, okay, we need to have Spanish language programming, or we need more Hispanic characters in popular programming. Again, just to kind of dovetail with what you said a little bit, and the LGBTQ concern, it has been not that many years that every shopping mall is rainbowed in June, but the idea that there's a commodification, there's a commercialization to what otherwise was a marginalized community, and then we're supposed to accept that quota has been filled. Look, it's June, there's rainbows. So the quota is filled now for all. But I mean, it's real. It's real. And even as you were talking, I was thinking, okay, so if it's commercial enough that we can have Taco Tuesday and Dia de los Muertos and Cinco de Mayo, then okay, bring your Mexican culture.
I really like Taco Tuesday.
Yeah. It would be more than Tuesday. More than Tuesday.
I think getting back to what we were speaking about a little bit before, is I don't think there's any difference between politics and storytelling. So much of politics is about storytelling, controlling narrative, and dishing out a story that you tell it enough to a big enough audience, you make them believe it's true, and therefore they will support this policy. They will support gross injustice. They will support systemic violence. And I think we should just, like, it's such a burden, but it is also such a gift to be in a position where you can tell a story that someone feels seen in. Like, that is such a beautiful, powerful thing. And I think back to myself as like a young gay person in a very conservative, kind of like violent-filled area. And truly, stories helped me like live, like helped me believe that I had a future and believe that I could be somewhere else. And that was literally just like TV and through the internet, just the internet. So we can never forget that, and not only feel that burden, but feel that gift that stories really can change lives. They can change the course of our political present and future. And I don't want to just see ourselves as the like ground-making change makers. I think there's like such incredible work that has happened to get us to here, and we should always honor the people who risked their lives, their livelihoods, to get us to let us be change makers. Yeah.
A mentor of mine, a filmmaking mentor of mine said something to me, which I think really adds on to what you just said, which is the generation before us was tasked with survival. Our generation is tasked with talking about it, and the next generation is tasked with breaking that cycle.
Yes.
Yeah.
I fully agree with that. Because, I mean, dovetailing off of what both of you have literally just said, but, like, the thing is, storytelling changes culture. And, like, because how many movies have we all seen that have created certain things that we now have as part of our culture? And the thing that's exciting to me is the language aspect of it. Because when I was growing up, I did not have language to describe what I was experiencing. And I got that language through the internet. And because I had I won't say the name Tumblr, but
Thank you,
but you know, because it was just such a free-for-all and an easy access to language and a development center for language. And I feel like film and storytelling and TV and cinema is a vehicle for language to get to people who maybe don't have access to other parts of the internet, or the internet in general, or they just don't know about it, or they don't know where to look. Because, like, Lord knows if you don't know about Tumblr, I know some people are shaking their head like, I don't know what Tumblr is out there. So, and that's totally fine. Like, that's just, you know, that was the vehicle that I had growing up, and being able to take this language that was developed by our predecessors, and you know, with the queer community specifically, the just loss of, not to get deep here for sad, but you know, there was a huge loss of our you know, our elders.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so there was a loss there was a loss of language, and it has been our generation that has had to pick up the pieces and be able to communicate the language to the next generation. And they're having the same discussions that we did, which is funny, but you know, it's a process, and it'll go through, and like, that's how change happens, is you see language, you take language, you change it.
And if you don't use it, it goes away.
Yeah.
You lose it.
Yeah.
So you have to keep using it and keep speaking and keep
And it can evolve, because queer used to be such, and I know some people who are from the South specifically who do not use that word, do not like that word associated with them. And that is a completely valid response to have to that word, because even to them, it was a slur hurled at them with violence. So.
This is why
Yeah.
I really liked what you were saying about, you know, your interest in genre. I actually think that's absolutely a massive strength, because, you know, what is genre? It's kind of like the pillars that the business stands on. You know what I mean? It's like, you have your action genre, you have your horror genre, you have this and that. These are established areas that we know people will go to for particular kinds of content. This is one of the reasons I'm saying I don't like the subgenre, because that it makes it all the work you're doing and everything that you're putting into it, that energy gets rerouted somewhere else, rather than, can we go to our mainstream outlets of what people are looking for and embed new reflections of society, current reflections of society, like tell stories that aren't within genre. And I think that's why, if you have a passion for genre, I totally do. I love action movies. I like grew up on 90s action films. Like, I could just nerd out for hours on it. But it's like, okay, let's have something that feels like the action genre, but is also doing a great service to society in terms of like representation and maybe bringing up issues. I've always felt that actually there have been ages in cinema that did a better, stronger job of talking about social justice issues, even metaphorically, but they were doing it within the big
1930s horror.
Absolutely.
Look at the classic horror films. They're
Huge.
talking about all the stuff we're talking about
huge.
right now.
The idea, like, I always talk about Jurassic Park because I feel like that's the one, like, everybody's seen it. Everybody's seen it, and everyone's like, wait, you're telling me that Jurassic Park gave me, like, a morality tale? But, like, that whole thing that they go on about, like, we were so concerned with whether we could, we never asked ourselves if we should. And it's just like, you tell me that we're not dealing with that still all the time. And this was like a multi-$100 million successful thing. It's like, that's what we need. We need that, the biggest platform possible to be able to kind of get that message out. This is our loudspeaker. It's actually one of the reasons I love film. I mean, it has the power to change lives. It does all the time. So we're very lucky, and you have to really work at it to get your turn up to the podium. But at some point you will, and people will listen. People will listen a lot better than with your stupid tweet.
5 years ago.
Yeah.
A lot better than 10 years ago.
Yeah,
People,
absolutely.
There's definitely more listening.
And one of the things I hope we all focus on is to be very intentional with how you brand and market yourself and control the flow of your own messaging, so that you don't feel reticent to put your truth out. And this is one of the things that I've become more and more concerned with. That okay, my work may stand in this space, but if I want to get to the next stage of my career, I have to very intentionally let people know who I am, what I stand for, and what my themes are. So what is, as a screenwriter, you're thinking, what's the premise, what's the theme? But I have to do that for me, because I don't want people projecting their prejudices onto me. And if I don't let people know very definitely, this is who I am, this is my brand, this is what I stand for, here's my log line. It was some funny meme I saw, which is, I wish dating apps came with a 60-second trailer. I was like, I need my 60-second trailer, so this is what I'm dealing with, this person's about. And I just think it's very important. It's something that I'd like us all to dig into if you haven't. But that's because I want you to control the flow of your own narrative. I want you to let people know how to associate you and not be in reaction to someone else's decision about you. And one final thought in regards to commercial versus critical success, and what does that do? So if you are the, not the stereotypical, power structure, and you gain critical success, how do you leverage that into commercial success? So these are some of the considerations that I'm asking everybody to really feel into that for their own careers. A lot of us as independent filmmakers have submitted our work and gained awards and been nominated and had critical success. But it does not mean that commercial and job opportunities and money follow that. So there's some next step, and I feel very deeply that next step is how you authentically market yourself and brand yourself.
That's also kind of like what she was talking about with, we need to be able to see this inclusivity behind the camera too, because that's a lot of that machine is happening behind the camera, and that's still just being run by the same 5 powerful people. It's going to be a problem.
It is a big deal. So I have another question, but I was just looking at the time. I'd love to gain some audience questions if anybody has any questions for our panelists.
Heather Wood, by the way, everybody. She's an incredible writer. She was a co-writer on our project that we just did, and we were out at AFM with, and she's awesome.
Congratulations.
That's awesome. I just kind of like on a personal level, like I feel like as filmmakers, there's like we talk a lot about the big picture things about it, and then also some personal things. But I kind of would like to know, is there anything in your personal experience that you like enjoy putting into your stories? If that makes sense, like something you're like, no, they get it wrong every time, so I'm gonna put this in. Just personally for you, that kind of gives you a little joy about it. Does that make sense?
Of course.
Yeah.
Always.
Yeah. Somebody want to take that?
I mean, interjecting the Arabic language in there is definitely a big one for me. Women who don't traditionally look like Arab women, like the stereotypical Arab woman is a huge one for me, and I get called out on it quite a bit actually back home. Very much so. Everyone's like, you can't do that. I'm like, what? Yeah, those are the two biggest ones for me, I think.
I'd like to do a scene in a Hispanic family where somebody leaves the table without finishing their meal, and God damn it, that doesn't happen. That's not a thing that happens. Are you kidding me? My mom would have been like, oye, siéntate. Like, you didn't finish. You're not allowed to get up away from the table. If you're, like, so I see what you're like, there's someone
That's
arguing.
your horror movie.
That's my horror movie. La chancla, dude. You're gonna get it. Yeah, that doesn't, I always see that and I'm like, hold on a second. They left.
I'm really passionate about the future of a lot of these regions. So I think, you know, you were speaking very eloquently about how, again, this idea of a monolithic experience. But I think twofold, specifically talking about the Middle East region, going backwards in time and seeing how advanced this culture was for millennia, and then extending that into the future and looking at a future where these regions are not just constantly being stripped bare of their resources and their people and their power, but actually envisioning, I'm bringing it back to Star Trek, a more utopic future for these regions, which is not to make everything squeaky clean and great, but to say, look, there is actually a way, a path forward, because what the current situation is not your future, right? Like there is another future that is possible. So that's something I'm very passionate about, and I haven't really been able to dig into too much, but it does sort of have a through line through a lot of my work, where it's just seeing a different potential future for this region.
I'm sorry, did anybody else want to answer this?
I was just gonna add, like, I think a gift of queer people is we always like transpose ourselves onto any story that doesn't include us anyway. like queer people are always like reading like these queer subtexts and these like relationships that they think very well could be happening, but maybe aren't, but maybe are. And so I think like playing with that, playing with like very specific queer humor, or like there's so much subtlety in queerness in a way that like capitalized queerness is so loud and rainbow and and there's just such subtlety that I love bringing into storytelling about queer people.
Oh, it's such a good point. If you think into the heritage of the arts and filmmaking, how many people behind the scenes as well as in front of the camera were queer, but you just didn't know it.
Yeah.
And were contributing and shaping and molding society and not out about it. And you had a question?
Well, it was based on kind of what you said, and one of the things that is frustrating to me is American exceptionalism, that we are the best. God bless America. America's it. It's the everything. To see what history was, if Mossadegh had been in power and stayed, America and Britain didn't get in there, what would that be like?
We'd be in a very different.
This is what I'm saying, and the history and the power, like, you know, and they were taking all the resources from it, and we still fucking do it now in Afghanistan, and this keeps repeating over and over again. And this is the part where I am so frustrated because the powers that be are still in power, and there are so many people who don't vote. We don't even look at those numbers, that we are the lowest participatory government in the world. Why? Because they're so disenfranchised. And so I am just, and like you were saying, the media, the movies, these are the stories that you're telling and need to be told. And we just need to get it in there and out there so that people know these stories. And the powers that be don't want these stories to be heard or known. And that's why you were saying storytelling is so important. I was a high school teacher, and now I'm teaching kindergarten through 2nd grade. And I am in the happiest place I've ever been. I'm telling you, because the stories are real. They're not afraid to tell the stories and just be honest and truthful. So in high school, that was one of the things I did, is I said, your story matters. And we need to get out there and tell everybody. I'm also involved with this thing called council, and we just listen and tell stories. And that's what's going to save this country, is when we're starting listening and telling each other stories on a community basis. So thank you for your work.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Yes, take it.
I just wanted to, my question is, how do you recommend that we balance the buzzword, and you talked a little bit about it, the trauma porn thing, like do you have any ideas on how to balance trauma porn with authenticity? And because, you know, we deal with that a lot. I deal with that as a producer, as a African American, as the stories that I'm trying to tell. Some of them are queer leaning, all of that kind of stuff. And there's just some authentic truths that are happening that are painful, like you said, but we don't want to, you know, always deal with. I think Till did it. I don't know if anyone saw that movie, but I feel like Till had a really good balance with telling that story in a way that wasn't, that they kind of didn't pull back, but they also told it in a way that didn't tip the scales into what we're now referring to as trauma porn.
I think a lot about Moonlight actually as like a portrait of a life in 3 parts, and being gay was not the beginning or ending of that story. It was so multifaceted in terms of identity and issues that a person is dealing with. And even though it had pain, it wasn't a tragic story to me. It is still a story of a person surviving and living a version of a truth. And so I think, like, again, not making the tragedy the totality of a story, because the reality is that all of us are here because we have survived. Because of, like, I hate the word, like, just using resilience as like the catch-all, but it's like there's pain in my life, and there's like humor and joy, and like just really seeing a whole picture and a whole story. That to me is like the foundation of good storytelling, and storytelling about, especially like identity-based storytelling. Because you're not putting yourself into that box. You are having, and even you can have like a film that's like completely like a comedy, but you can have trace elements, like trace moments that could even just be what is physically in the room on set, that like touches back to something that wasn't pure, like, oh great, perfect, easy life.
I want to mention something about Till, because I saw a little clip. The filmmakers were honoring Emmett Till's mother's wish that her son's tragedy and murder not be the focus more than catalyzing change. And that idea that, unfortunately, people are drawn to conflict, and even as screenwriters, we're taught that the core of everything we do has to involve conflict from the beginning log line, the one-liner. So that feeling that, okay, you know you have to involve conflict in your drama, but then what's bigger than the conflict, catalyzing change in some way? I mean, I hope so. I hope that's an answer.
That's the balance.
And
though,
why
right?
you're telling the story.
Yeah.
Are you telling it because it's an authentic story, or are you telling it because another movie 2 months ago made a boatload of money?
Right.
I really think if you start there, then that's your answer.
Well, thank you, everybody. It was amazing.